I was in disbelief when I saw my wife at a dinner with another man, without her wedding ring. That scene destroyed me inside, as if the tie was tighter than it should be, as if everything I was had been ripped away at once. I watched from afar, with my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that it felt like I was inside a tunnel, watching the life of another man, one who had been betrayed without realizing it. As she smiled, leaned forward, touched his hand on the table and let out that laugh that I thought was reserved only for me, everything we had built came crashing down. Years of complicity, trips, retirement plans together, every gesture she had made in the last few months was revisited in my mind in seconds, and now it made sense. The sudden coldness, the rush to shower, the smell of a perfume that wasn't mine on her blouse, the rehearsed excuse of getting together with friends. That was it. It was clear. But what devastated me the most was not the man, nor the dinner, nor the laughter. It was the absence of the ring. That was too symbolic. That was her telling the world, I am free, I no longer belong to anyone. That was the trigger. I didn't cry. Not then. I just turned my back and walked slowly to my car. On the radio, a song that used to be ours was playing. It now seemed like an insult. On the way back, the silence in the car gave me space to reflect out loud. I had been betrayed. It wasn't just a betrayal of the body, it was a betrayal of history. She had robbed me of my right to be a partner, she had removed me from the equation of her own life without even asking me. The images of the dinner came back like flashes, her without her wedding ring, her fingers adorned with a new ring, perhaps a gift from her new lover, perhaps bought by herself as a symbol of freedom, or worse, of a new beginning. A new beginning without me. I relived the moment when I had given her that ring, trembling, with my face sweaty with nerves, kneeling before her. I remembered her smile, her tears, the yes that seemed eternal. I asked myself, as I crossed the empty intersections of the city, where did I go wrong? How did I not notice? In the following days, I tried to maintain my composure. She still didn't know I had seen her. When she came home that night, she lied naturally. She said that dinner with her friends had been fun, that they were planning a trip together. She kissed me on the forehead, went to the shower, and didn't bother to lie down next to me. But I knew. And knowing, silently, is a poison that eats away at you from the inside. The worst kind of torture is the one that no one sees. I watched her making coffee and felt disgusted. I remembered her laughing with the other guy, and now smiling at me as if nothing had happened. It was as if I were being fooled by a soap opera actress, rehearsed, cold, cynical. And the worst part was that I still felt something. I loved her. Or I thought I did. When I finally confronted her, it was on a Sunday, late in the afternoon. The sun was streaming through the living room window and she was folding clothes on the couch. I said, my voice firm but shaking inside, I saw you with him. She turned pale. She was speechless for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity. The pile of clothes fell to the floor. She swallowed hard and stammered, it wasn't what you think. I laughed. A desperate laugh. You weren't wearing a ring at the restaurant we went to for our 5th anniversary. And you say it wasn't what I think? What the hell did you want me to think? She tried to argue, saying she was confused, that it was a phase. She talked about loneliness, routine, boredom, the feeling of being invisible. But I listened to every word like someone listening to sand slipping through their fingers. I was no longer part of that plot. She had replaced me emotionally long before she betrayed me physically. The decision had been made, divorce. And what's more, it would be a divorce with a way back. I wasn't going to be just the betrayed one. I wasn't going to accept being the victim in the story. I was going to get back on my feet, rebuild myself and, most importantly, show that no one destroys someone who has memory, dignity and courage. She left home a few weeks later. She said she needed time, space, to find herself. Little did she know that what awaited her was a nightmare. That man, the same one she had dined with, smiling easily and holding hands on the white tablecloth, disappeared from her life. He left a note and cancelled the trip they had planned. And worse, he had convinced her to sell some of the jewelry she had inherited from her mother and put the money into a travel fund, which now no longer existed. She was left without him, without her jewelry, and without her home. And yet, she had the audacity to knock on my door, weeks later, saying that she wanted to come back, that she regretted it, that she realized the value of what she had lost. "You are the only man who has ever truly loved me," she said with tears in her eyes, standing there, in the same doorway she had passed so many times as his wife. But I, at that moment, was a different person. I looked her in the eye with the same firmness as when I confronted her. I told her that there was no longer any room for her in my life. That I could not welcome back someone who had destroyed a home for an affair. And it was there, on the doorstep, that she saw, over my shoulder, the silhouette of a woman approaching from the stairs, smiling, with a glass of wine in her hand. The new woman in my life. Someone who met me in the midst of chaos and made me learn to breathe again. She said nothing. She just looked, swallowed her tears and took a step back. She walked away. But the most curious thing was not that she tried to go back. The most curious thing was what I discovered later. Something that made me reevaluate my entire history with her, every gesture, every absence, every excuse. A revelation that had been before my eyes for years, but that only made sense after it was all over. And that revelation, well, that's the part of the story that no one ever imagined. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and will never support any form of betrayal. All the stories told are fictional, but inspired by real situations that show how infidelity is capable of destroying homes, lives and feelings. The moral behind each narrative is clear: whoever betrays, reaps the consequences. Get ready now to hear a story shocking, intense and unforgettable. Take a deep breath, because what comes next will stir your emotions. Daniel and Laura, who had been married for 11 years, lived in a corner house with large windows and a well-kept garden. The neighborhood where they lived was not luxurious, but it had a peaceful feel that matched the organized appearance of their lives. Daniel was a logistics manager at a food distribution company and Laura was a high school literature teacher. They had a simple but well-structured routine, the kind that many would consider monotonous, but which, for them, always seemed like a safe haven. Laura loved plants and Daniel never minded getting his hands dirty to help her on Sunday mornings. In the eyes of neighbors and acquaintances, they were the typical couple who had met at the right time in life, who had built a mature, solid relationship with plans that seemed to be always in progress. They did not have children, and this, at one point, had already been a sore point, but over time they both seemed to accept that life could still be full. Daniel was a discreet man, quiet and attentive to details. He kept his words to himself, but was generous with his gestures. He never forgot important dates, always left a note on the fridge when he left early and knew exactly what kind of wine Laura liked on the weekends. Behind his serious expression, there was a man who nurtured a genuine and silent love, perhaps even naive. Laura, on the other hand, was outgoing. Her students adored her for the passionate way she taught. She had an engaging way of talking about books, of making analogies, of transforming real life into everyday poetry. Her laugh was easy, and her gaze was always curious. Laura liked to question, to challenge routines, to feel alive in everything she did. That was what Daniel loved about her from the very first moment, the life she carried in her gestures, the intensity she imprinted on simple things. They met in a coffee shop. He was reading a book on business logistics while she, sitting at the table next to him, corrected essays with colored highlighters. A sudden wind knocked her papers to the floor and he bent down to help. The touch of their hands on the same papers was enough to start a conversation that soon turned into coffee, then dinner, and a few months later, the beginning of a life together. The house they lived in was their first joint purchase. They carefully renovated each room, deciding on every detail together, the color of the walls, the type of sofa, the lighting on the balcony. They created a home, a space where, little by little, the marks of time began to overlap the plans that once seemed eternal. In the early years of marriage, everything was new. The end-of-year trips, the improvised dinners during the week, the late nights watching old movies and laughing at the poorly done dubbing. But as the years went by, the routine began to set in invisibly, like fine dust that accumulates without us noticing. Conversations became more practical, meals quicker, touches more brief. There was still affection, but there was no longer that urgency. There was still affection, but the displays became scarce. They both worked a lot, came home tired, and weekends became more about rest than about being present. Despite this, Daniel continued to believe that they were fine. He never suspected that there were dangerous distances. When Laura started going out more with her schoolmates, he thought it was natural. When she started dressing up more, he thought it was beautiful. When she wanted to start taking a painting class on Wednesday nights, he supported her. After all, he knew how much she needed movement, stimulation, everything that her world seemed to demand. He, with his methodical soul, did not follow this intensity, but he loved to observe from afar. He thought it was beautiful how she devoted herself to what she did, how she spoke with a sparkle in her eyes when she discovered a new artist, how her fingers were stained with paint when she came back from art classes. Laura, on the other hand, saw Daniel as a safe haven. He was reliable, predictable, and for a long time that was exactly what she wanted, a love that didn't tremble, that didn't threaten to collapse at the slightest wind. However, over time, this predictability began to suffocate her. Not because of him, but because she herself began to miss something she couldn't name. Sometimes she would spend hours in silence in her painting studio, trying to translate what she felt into lines, and she failed. She tried to write, she tried to talk to friends, she tried to convince herself that it was just a phase. And maybe it was. Maybe it was just a phase. Daniel, unaware of any of this, continued to tend the garden, pay the bills on time, make her coffee before he left for work. He continued to observe her as he had on the first day, even when she was far away. He continued to keep the small rituals alive, the same as always. It never occurred to him that something could be wrong. He thought that was how long-lasting marriages worked, that the initial passion gave way to companionship, that the love became quieter, more contained, but never ceased to exist. On one of those ordinary nights, while Laura was painting in the studio and he was watching some random documentary in the living room, their paths were already drifting apart, even though they shared the same roof. But love, even if shaky, still existed there. There was still hope between the lines, a desire to rescue something that seemed to be slowly slipping through the fingers of the days. They still slept in the same bed. They still said goodnight. They still hugged, even if only briefly. What Daniel didn't see was the emptiness that was accumulating between these routines. And Laura, in turn, tried to convince herself that there was still time to find that feeling again. But she didn't know how to ask for help, she didn't know how to say what she was feeling without seeming ungrateful. After all, he was a good man. And she knew it. During the holidays that year, they decided to travel to a country house lent by a couple of friends. It was just the two of them. Laura took paintbrushes and notebooks, Daniel took books and his work cell phone, which he swore he wouldn't answer. The trip had its good moments. They walked together, had long meals, laughed at old stories. But there were pauses. Moments when the silence between them said more than any argument could say. And yet, they didn't fight. They never fought. Because maybe the problem between them wasn't anger, but the lack of intensity. It was as if they were two souls too gentle to face each other, and at the same time too distant to meet again. When they returned, the routine imposed itself again with all its force. School returned with intense demands, Daniel's work was more demanding, and the distance settled in again, like a dust that no one could clean. At a certain point, Laura started to spend more time in the studio than in the living room. And Daniel started to sleep before her. Their schedules began to clash, and dinners for two became solitary dinners. Even so, neither of them talked about it. It was as if the silence was a tacit agreement, an attempt to keep up appearances of a life that was no longer the same. Among friends, they continued to be the couple that made it. Laura still posted smiling photos on social media. Daniel still held her hand at family dinners. But inside the house, within the most intimate gestures, there was a gap. And it was there, in that void, that history was about to change. Because behind a calm routine, an admired couple, an apparently stable life, there was a latent restlessness, a cry stuck in the throat of someone who loved, but no longer knew how to continue. And it would be this restlessness, silent, invisible and accumulated over the years, that would put everything to the test very soon. Laura began to change so subtly that, for a long time, Daniel didn't even notice. Her schedule became more unstable, her justifications more vague, her expressions more distracted. She started answering calls outside the classroom, going out to sort out something for school on the weekends, and distancing herself from the moments that used to be reserved for the two of them. At first, Daniel didn't suspect anything. He knew her rhythm, he knew how absorbing her work could be and how much she valued his individuality. But what had once been silent admiration became a muffled discomfort, as if something inside him was trying to trigger an alert that he insisted on ignoring. It was as if his heart knew before his mind, as if Daniel's body already felt that something was shifting, slipping through his fingers. He began to notice her absence in the details. The toothbrush that used to be next to his always fell to the corner of the sink, as if it had been used in a hurry. Her favorite cup, which used to rest on the counter after breakfast, was now dry, clean, and untouched. The clothes in the closet changed position, new perfumes appeared in the bathroom, and there was a new sparkle in Laura's eyes, a sparkle that wasn't his. Daniel tried to stifle that feeling with rational arguments. He thought it could just be a phase, maybe something emotional that she wasn't ready to share. He decided to give her space, as he always did. Maybe that was what she needed. But as the days went by, he began to doubt his own lucidity. He felt like someone who watches a movie and already knows the ending, but still hopes for a different outcome. One Friday night, she arrived home later than usual. She was wearing a dress he didn't recognize and had her hair down, makeup on, and her lipstick was already a little smudged. She smiled when she came in, said that dinner with her schoolmates had gone on for a long time, that they had wasted time talking about projects. Daniel just nodded, watching her walk towards the room. His gaze fell on the ring finger of his left hand. For the first time, the ring was not there. He felt his stomach churn, but he held it in. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe he had taken it out to paint. Perhaps. Everything was maybe. And it was at this point that he began to collect questions like someone collecting invisible wounds. The next morning, while she slept, he revisited the previous night in his mind. He imagined the faces she might have met, the hidden touches under the table, the looks full of intentions that she pretended not to notice. There was a kind of silence between them that was no longer just a lack of dialogue, but a lack of connection. Daniel, although reluctant, began to observe more closely. He noticed that she hid her cell phone when he approached, that messages were frequently deleted, that there was a rush to get away whenever the phone vibrated. The following week, she went out on a Thursday night claiming an impromptu get-together with her schoolmates. But something in him prevented him from accepting this answer with the same passivity as before. He decided to follow her. He was overcome by an impulse he had never felt before. An almost desperate need to see the truth with his own eyes. He left the house a few minutes later, kept a safe distance and saw her car park in front of a restaurant they knew well. A place he himself had chosen for their 5-year wedding anniversary dinner. Laura got out of the car with a smile on her face, holding a small bag, and walked lightly toward the entrance. Daniel parked further away, stayed inside the car and waited. His heart was beating like a fire alarm. He waited for about 20 minutes until she reappeared, not alone. Beside her walked an elegant-looking man, with a dress shirt folded over his forearms, laughing at something she had said. And then he saw it. The gesture. The touch of hands. The absence of a wedding ring. Daniel didn't move. He stood there, staring at that scene as if his body had frozen. There was no shouting, no clashes. Just silence. That kind of silence that kills you from the inside. He felt his chest tighten, his throat dry, his eyes burn. It wasn't anger, it was grief. Mourning everything he believed to be real. For everything he built. For all the nights he waited, for all the dinners he prepared her food with love. He saw the woman he loved smile like she hadn't smiled in a long time. Except it wasn't for him. And that hurt more than any punch could ever hurt. On the way back, Daniel drove in silence, his hands sweaty on the steering wheel. He couldn't stop picturing her face at that table. He began to question everything, the last few months, the cold gestures, the rehearsed apologies. Every, "I love you," he heard now seemed like irony. Every hug became a blow. When he got home, Laura was already asleep. Or pretending to be asleep. He lay down next to her without making a sound, his body heavy, his eyes open and staring at the dark ceiling. The silence between them was deafening. And he knew it. He knew there was no going back. He knew that something inside him had broken irreversibly. In the following days, Daniel maintained his composure. He didn't confront her. He didn't cry. He observed her. He began to notice her schedule, her new habits, her different perfumes. Everything made sense now. It was as if a blindfold had been removed from her eyes. She went out more and more. The kisses became occasional. The glances, absent. One day, during breakfast, she smiled and asked if he would like to go on a holiday trip. Daniel replied that he couldn't, because of work. But deep down, he had already decided, there would be no more trips. Not with her. One Wednesday, he arrived home early. Laura wasn't there. The painting studio was empty, the lights off. The house was silent. He walked through the kitchen and noticed a half-empty glass of wine on the table, still fresh. Next to it, her cell phone. Unlocked. As if she had left in a hurry. Daniel hesitated. But something guided him. He picked up the phone and began to read. The messages were there. Recent conversations. Exchanges of affection, plans, promises. And one detail that made him shudder, she had sold some old family items, inherited from her mother, to book a trip with the man. A package to the coast. It was there, in that gesture, that he saw what he hadn't realized yet, she wasn't just getting involved with someone. She was rebuilding a new life. And she had completely excluded him from that plan. That night, he said nothing. He went back to keeping everything inside, as he always did. But now, it was no longer passivity. It was decision. A silent, firm decision that he would carry through to the end. Laura returned around 11. She was smiling, as if nothing was out of place. She went into the room, changed her clothes, lay down next to him and said something about the painting class. He only responded with a guttural sound, pretending to be almost asleep. But he didn't sleep. He spent the whole night awake. For the first time, he felt not only sadness, but a calm anger. A certainty that something needed to change. In the days that followed, Daniel began to withdraw emotionally. He stopped asking about her days. He stopped making her breakfast. He started leaving earlier and coming back later. He reconnected with old friends. He began to take care of himself in a way he hadn't done in years. He cut his hair, changed his wardrobe, bought a bike. Laura noticed, but didn't comment. Maybe she was relieved by the separation. Maybe she was just too blind to the new plot she was building away from him. Until one night, Daniel went out to dinner alone. He wanted to breathe. Sit at a random table and not think. And it was there, between one dish and another, that he met a woman who would change the course of his days. A chance encounter, without intentions, without rushing. But there was something there. A kind of silent, light connection, like he hadn't felt in a long time. They talked for hours, without pressure, without masks. And he, for the first time in a long time, felt alive. Meanwhile, Laura continued with her travel plans. He set the date, prepared the itinerary, asked for time off from work. I believed that that moment would mark the beginning of a new phase. That I would finally be ready to move forward, to take on the new. But what she didn't imagine was that the ground she was walking on was about to collapse. And that everything she thought was safe, about to happen, would be dismantled piece by piece with a revelation she was not prepared to face. On the morning before the long-planned trip, Laura woke up early, strangely excited. She spent a good amount of time in the bathroom, applied light makeup, and carefully fixed her hair, even though she was in no rush to leave. She walked around the house with a sparkle in her eyes that she hadn't had inside for a long time. She put on a soft soundtrack to play in the kitchen and made her favorite coffee, humming softly as she stirred the sugar in the porcelain cup. She was about to embark on something that, according to her, symbolized a new beginning. The man she was involved with had promised her a new life, with freedom, passion, and shared plans. And even though her conscience still murmured fragments of guilt, Laura silenced them with convenient rationalizations. She thought she deserved this, after years of a stable but lukewarm marriage. She believed that her courage to seek something new was, deep down, a legitimate attempt to be happy. From the other side of the house, Daniel watched her with calm eyes but a distant look. He was sitting in the armchair in the living room with the newspaper on his lap, but his eyes were fixed on her. There was a serenity on his face that Laura couldn't decipher. Later, while she was packing her suitcase in the living room, Daniel called her to talk. His tone of voice was too calm, which made Laura feel slightly uncomfortable. She approached slowly, her eyes attentive to his gestures. He asked her to sit next to him, and for a few seconds they were silent. Then Daniel looked her straight in the eyes and said firmly, "I know about the trip. I know who you're going with. And I know what you did." Laura froze. The impact was immediate. Her breathing was short, her body went limp, and her hands began to sweat. She tried to say something, but he continued. "You don't need to make anything up. I saw you. I read the messages. I know enough." She fell silent. Her throat closed. The words were useless. Daniel took a deep breath. "But what you don't know is that he won't show up. The trip was cancelled by him. And you were left behind." She blinked, as if she hadn't understood. And then, the expression of confusion was replaced by panic. "What do you mean he cancelled? Are you saying this to humiliate me? Are you making this up now because you found out and want to see me grovel?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He just stood up, walked to the bookshelf, and picked up an envelope. When she opened it, Laura found a handwritten letter. It was from the man she had been involved with. A direct, cold, almost bureaucratic text. It said that she had decided to take a break, that his life was more complicated than she had expected, that she no longer wanted to be involved. And that the money for the trip, the reservations, the tours, everything she had sold to pay for it, was irretrievably lost. He had disappeared. Disappeared from the map. No contact. No explanation. The suitcase she had packed so carefully that day now looked like a suitcase from an abandoned circus. Her face was falling apart in disbelief and despair. "No, it's not possible," he promised me. Daniel remained still, observing her every reaction with firm but pained eyes. "You bet everything on someone who used you. And in the process, you destroyed what we still had. And the worst part, you didn't even look back." Laura tried to explain, to justify, to fight back her own regret. She said she was confused, that things weren't simple, that marriage no longer made her happy, that she had tried, that Daniel had changed too, that she didn't want to hurt him. But her voice was shaking. The control she had always had over her words was now failing her. Daniel didn't raise his voice, didn't cry, didn't question her. She just said that she had given it her all. That she believed in their story until the end. And that now, after everything, she had taught him what it meant to be alone even within a relationship. That was when Laura asked why he was so calm. Why he wasn't yelling, why he wasn't destroying the house like in so many movies. He smiled and replied, "Because I rebuilt myself before you even collapsed. I didn't wait for you to do that." What Laura didn't know yet, and what Daniel now revealed calmly, was that in the last few days he had not only reorganized his life, but was already moving forward. Not with resentment, but with awareness. He had met someone. Someone who looked at him again with truth, with lightness, with curiosity. Someone who listened to him without judgment, who didn't see him as a boring or predictable man, but as someone who still had something to offer. Someone who awakened in him what Laura had let lie dormant for so long. When she heard that, she turned pale. She tried to laugh, as if doubtful, as if she thought it was an act. "Are you telling me you've overcome me? In such a short time?" And Daniel replied, without hesitation, "You think it's a short time, but I've been alone for years in this marriage. The end didn't start today. It started long before you walked out the door." Laura got up from the armchair, staggering. She ran her hands over her face as if she wanted to wake up from a nightmare. She looked at the suitcase still open on the sofa, at the carefully folded clothes, at the shoes she had chosen with such care to impress a man who had not deigned to show up. A silence formed. A dense silence. A silence of scattered shards. And then she asked, in a weak voice, "Do you love her?" Daniel thought for a few seconds. "Not yet. But I'm starting to. And this is already much more than what I've felt inside for a long time." The answer was a knife. A thin, precise blade. Laura wanted to say something, but the words escaped her. Reality hit her hard. She finally realized that what she had lost was not just a husband. It was a man who had been by her side, even in silence, even in absence, even in doubt. She realized that she had thrown away a love that, although discreet, was loyal. A love that did not shout, but remained. A love that did not demand anything, but was always there. And now, she had been replaced. Not out of revenge. Not out of anger. But by someone who knew how to see what she had failed to see. Daniel walked her to the door. She did not move. She stood there, with her hands at her sides. She asked to talk later. She said she wanted time, that she needed to think, that she still loved him. Daniel just shook his head gently. "You already had time. And you made your choice. Now, it's my turn." And that's how she left. Through the same door that he entered so many times with shopping bags, with flowers, with smiles. But now, with nothing. No plans. No support. Without the man who, for so long, believed in her. The weight of the suitcase in his hands was no greater than the weight of regret. And yet, she didn't know that the worst was yet to come. Because the man who deceived her left behind much more than a letter. And what he carried with him, Laura would discover too late. Laura left the house staggering, suitcase in hand and her soul in tatters. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, but she barely noticed. Her vision was blurry, her legs were shaking, her entire body felt like it was made of cracked glass about to shatter. She walked down the sidewalk as if she were leaving a battlefield, disoriented, trying to process everything she had just heard. The car was still there, parked on the street. She got in, threw her suitcase violently into the back seat and stood for a few minutes with her hands resting on the steering wheel, trying to control her breathing. Her fingers were shaking so much that she couldn't turn the key. She was alone. Not alone because she was without him, but alone because there was no longer a world to return to, nor a new one to enter. The man she had placed all her hopes in had simply evaporated, and the only one who had always been by her side was now walking away, step by step, without rancor, but with determination. That terrified her more than if he had shouted or slammed doors. His serene coldness, the clarity with which he stated that he was moving on, all of that was more cutting than any planned revenge. She drove aimlessly until she stopped in front of her sister's house. She didn't know where else to go. She was greeted with surprise, and when she saw Laura's distraught face, her sister didn't need to ask anything. She just opened the door, offered her a glass of water, and waited. They sat on the couch, and after a long silence, Laura broke down. Her words came out in a rush, between sobs and attempts at justifications that she herself no longer believed. She talked about the other man, the promise of the trip, the abandonment, and then about Daniel, about the new woman, about the indifference that killed her inside. Her sister listened to everything without interrupting, without consoling. When Laura finished, the silence weighed heavily between the two. And then, her sister asked in a low voice, "Do you want him back, or are you just hurt because you're no longer the center of his story?" That question was like a punch in the stomach. Laura didn't know how to answer. She felt ashamed. She felt angry. But deep down, something in that question hit her harder than any confession. Because maybe she didn't want Daniel back out of love, but out of ego. Because she knew she lost him to someone who saw in him what she failed to see. In the following days, she tried to get back into her routine, but everything seemed out of focus. Going back to school, painting, talking to classmates, nothing made sense. Her mind was trapped in the image of Daniel smiling with another woman, building something new, while she dug into her own ruins. She tried to contact him twice, but he didn't respond. She sent him a handwritten letter, spilling regrets and memories, but got no response. And then, on a muggy Tuesday morning, a notification in her email lit the fuse of something she could never have foreseen. It was a transaction notice. A significant amount had been transferred from the joint account, an old account that Laura had forgotten to unlink, to an unknown account. Finding it strange, she accessed the statement and saw other transactions, all made in the last 3 months. It wasn't Daniel. And he would never do something like that without telling her. There were amounts in the name of third parties, triangulated transfers, payments in digital currencies. A pain in her stomach made her double over. The name of the recipient was repeated in almost every transaction, the same man she had planned to run away with. Laura froze. In seconds, she ran to her laptop and accessed her message history, old files, and saved searches. Everything she had previously ignored, she now analyzed with the eyes of someone who was suspicious of every comma. She discovered that the man's number had been deactivated. The account where the money had been deposited was linked to a shell company. And, worse still, some of her banking information had been provided by her, at one of the times when he asked for help making a hotel reservation. The penny dropped abruptly. She had been used. Financially, emotionally, existentially. He had never intended to build anything with her. It was just a scheme, a plan patiently devised to suck as much as possible. And she, naive, gave it all away without even protecting herself. She cried. She screamed. She locked herself in the bathroom for hours, huddled on the cold ceramic floor. She thought about going to the police, but what would she say? That she had been deceived by a lover to whom she had given access data to old accounts. Who sold family jewels for a fantasy. Pride choked her. The shame was unbearable. A few days later, she decided to look for Daniel. Not to apologize, she already knew that part was useless, but to warn him about the risk they had taken together. Maybe he had also been involved in some breach. Maybe there were documents she had signed on behalf of the couple. She arranged to meet and he, out of respect, accepted. They met at a discreet cafe, late in the afternoon. He arrived punctually, elegant, with a calm expression. She, on the other hand, seemed smaller than she had ever been. Her face bore visible marks of sleepless nights, and her body bore a shyness that had not existed between them before. Laura explained the situation in detail. She gave him the receipts, their names, their information. Daniel listened attentively, without judgment. When she finished, he thanked her. He said he would take care of everything with the lawyer, that he would take the legal action. She nodded. There was something strange in the way he looked at her. There was no anger, no sadness. There was compassion. And that, for some reason, was even more painful. When it was time to say goodbye, Laura touched his hand. She apologized. Not for the betrayal, she had done that before, but for not seeing who he was. She said he had always been everything she needed, but that out of pride she had looked for something outside, thinking she deserved more, when in fact she was destroying what was most rare. Daniel gently squeezed her fingers, looked deep into her eyes, and replied, "It took me a while to see myself too. But when I saw who I was with you, I knew I needed to change. And now, I am someone whole, even without you." She let out a shaky sigh, lowered her head, and he stood up. Laura stood there, alone at the table, staring at her half-empty cup. She finally understood what true repentance was. It wasn't an apology. It was the understanding of what was lost when one didn't value what one had. The following week, Laura received a visit from a court official. Daniel had filed a formal request for divorce and, in the petition, had already excluded any financial participation of her in the accounts and assets recently acquired. The lawyer would take care of the legal part, and she would leave with what was rightfully hers. Nothing more. She signed the papers with trembling hands. She knew that this was the end. And there would be no commas. There would be no pause for reconsideration. It was the end of a story that she herself had undone. By the end of the month, Daniel was no longer living in the old house. He moved with his new partner to a smaller but cozy apartment. She was different from Laura, less exuberant, calmer. But there was a constant affection in her, a listening ear, a lightness that Daniel had not even remembered was possible to experience. Laura, in turn, returned to painting. Not for pleasure, but for necessity. "I needed to let it out, to transform everything I felt into ink." The screens now carried dark tones, broken shapes, distorted figures. "I spent hours in the studio, surrounded by memories that I could no longer touch. Sometimes I would look at my phone and still wait for a message that would never come. Not from that man who deceived her. But from Daniel. One last sign, one last chance. But she knew it would never come. And what ate away at her the most was knowing that it was all her fault. Because she destroyed, with her own hands, the only place where she was truly loved. And in the silence of the early morning, between dry paints and hard brushes, he was left with only one bitter certainty: betrayal has a price. And hers, now, was priceless. Laura began to live as if she were walking on rubble. With every step he took, he felt the creaking of what had been his life breaking beneath his feet. The silence in the house where she returned to live, now alone, was suffocating. The old room, where he had once shared a bed and a world with someone, seemed bigger than he needed, but smaller than he could bear. Every morning, I woke up not because I wanted to, but because I had to, and even then my body resisted, weighed me down, dragged itself along without conviction. She had the feeling of being trapped in a parallel time, where nothing was moving forward, where the past was repeated on the walls, in the closets, in the drawers that she could no longer open. The kitchen, the place where he had so often shared smiles over a hot coffee, was now the scene of solitary, hurried and almost always incomplete meals. I had lost my appetite, my sleep, my lightness. And, most importantly, to herself. Daniel, on the other hand, was not just rebuilding his life, he was giving it new meaning. He was aware that something inside him had also died, but he chose not to carry the grief for longer than necessary. In the process of liberation, he had discovered a strength he didn't know he had. Each day with his new wife was an affirmation of this. She didn't replace Laura, she didn't fill a hole, but she walked beside him lightly, with a real presence. It was a relationship without masks, where every word was heard, every gesture was reciprocated. Daniel had learned, with all the pain, that love is not blind insistence, but a conscious choice. And he finally chose to take care of himself. As he blossomed, Laura dove deeper into herself. He spent hours in the studio, producing intense, abstract paintings, full of pain and guilt. Some he sold at local fairs, others he kept, unable to let go of them. What was once just a hobby became an escape valve, and soon an obsession. Paintings became the only space where he could still express himself without feeling ashamed. The few times I met old acquaintances, I noticed the sidelong glances and the questions disguised as cordiality. I knew it was being talked about, I knew the story had spread. It was as if everyone knew, but no one said. And that was worse than any confrontation. One day, when visiting a local art gallery to propose an exhibition, she was surprised to see one of her paintings hanging, without her knowing. A friend, without warning, had sent the work for evaluation. And there, in front of the painting, a gray-haired woman commented to another, "It's painful, but there's a truth that we feel in our bones." It's as if the painting were silently screaming. Laura smiled, without being recognized. For the first time in a long time, she felt that perhaps there was still something of her that was worthwhile. That perhaps, even having failed as a wife, as a lover, as an accomplice, she could be something beyond the mistake she had made. But the dilemma that arose in her conscience was greater than that. Who would she become from then on? Was it possible to build something new on ruins, without denying what she had done, without romanticizing what she had caused? At the same time, Daniel was invited to participate in a business lecture event, as a result of the new professional cycle that had begun with the sale of the company. There, he met old and new faces. He spoke to people who admired his resilience, who praised his stance on the end of a marriage and the beginning of a new phase. He listened to everything with humility, but deep down he knew that there was nothing heroic about it. There were, rather, painful choices, sleepless nights, internal conflicts that did not end with a simple moving on. At one of the post-event dinners, between glasses of wine and lively conversation, someone commented, "You were lucky. Not everyone can come out of betrayal clean." Daniel smiled slightly, but inside something hurt. He had not felt clean at any moment. Only exhausted. He knew that he had not come out unscathed. Luck had not freed him from the pain. He had simply decided that it would not define him. Laura, upon learning of his participation in the event, felt a mixture of pride and sadness. On impulse, he wrote a letter, not of apology, but of gratitude. She was grateful that he had not retaliated with cruelty, that he had not exposed her, that he had maintained his dignity even though he had been injured. She said she was trying to find a new path, not to get him back, but to not lose herself even further. He signed with his full name, no surnames, no pretensions. Just hoping he would read it with an unarmed heart. She didn't know if he would read it. There would be no answer. But for the first time in months, he slept with a clearer conscience. A few weeks later, a mutual friend invited them both to a community art exhibit. Unbeknownst to them, they both accepted. When Laura arrived, she felt the air disappear for a moment when she saw him from afar, talking to a small, relaxed group, laughing. He saw her a few minutes later. And their eyes met. There was no tension, no discomfort. Just recognition. As if, at that moment, they both knew that the cycle was, in fact, coming to an end. They chatted briefly, talking about the paintings, the exhibit, the gallery's cafe. At one point, they fell silent. Laura looked at a large painting, full of dark tones, with violent lines. She said, almost in a whisper, "There are things we only understand when they break." Daniel agreed. "And there are things we only appreciate when we lose them." She didn't answer. She just smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. At the end of the night, he left with his new partner, hand in hand, serene. Laura stayed a little longer. He talked to other artists, talked about his works. She still felt a throbbing pain from time to time, but it was no longer a pain that paralyzed her. It was a memory. A scar. And like every scar, even if marked forever, it no longer bled. In the following days, she began to visit the local orphanage as a volunteer. She taught painting to children who, like her, needed to express what they could not say. There, she discovered an unexpected meaning. Not as redemption. Not as compensation. But as a way to transform the chaos she had experienced into something useful. She knew she would not be the same as before. And she didn't want to be. Because now, every gesture she made needed to come from a more honest place. Every step, more conscious. The dilemma that still haunted her was how to live with guilt without letting it define who she was. And that was the answer she sought, day after day, without rushing, without shortcuts. Daniel, in turn, started a small business focused on sustainability, something he had always admired but never had the time to get involved in. With the support of his new partner, he saw the business grow. He rediscovered pleasure in routine, in the simplicity of Sundays, in the small moments of shared silence. He no longer spoke about Laura, but sometimes he thought about her, not with longing, but with the lucidity of someone who had learned to respect their own limits. And, above all, from someone who knew that starting over is not about erasing the past, but using it as a basis to build something more solid, more conscious, more human. Their reunion at that art event was not the end of the story, nor was it a comma for new chapters. It was simply the realization that, even after an emotional tragedy, it is still possible to rise up. It is still possible to choose not to become bitter. It is still possible to look into the eyes of the person who hurt you and see, no longer the enemy, but the human being, imperfect, flawed, and yet worthy of empathy. And that was what made their story not only real, but necessary. What Laura didn't know yet, however, was that the man who had deceived her, the one who had disappeared with the money, had left one last trace that would change the course of some truths. A trace that would resurface unexpectedly, shedding new light on everything she thought she had already understood. And this detail, forgotten in the shadows, would be the final link in a story that still hasn't told everything. It was a cold, foggy morning when Laura received an envelope with no return address, left under the door of the studio. She thought it was some kind of feedback about the art workshops she had been offering at the orphanage, perhaps something left by one of the volunteers, but when she opened it, she saw that inside there was only a single photograph folded in half. When she unfolded it, her heart stopped for a few seconds. She immediately recognized the face of the man she had been involved with, the one who had disappeared without a trace, next to another woman, one who was not her, smiling in front of a foreign immigration sign. On the back of the photo, written in firm, cursive writing, was just a date and a name, Carla, Bogota, January. Laura felt her stomach churn. It was as if a new layer of truth was opening up before her, with an even more bitter taste. This was not just a personal betrayal. It was something bigger. Something premeditated, carefully articulated. She had been a pawn in a scheme, and now, even months later, she was still being pulled into that dirty game. Hours later, Laura took the photo to the police station. She didn't know if she would get anything, but she felt she couldn't just ignore it. She reported the involvement, the fraud, the data, the financial transactions. The police officer who attended to her listened carefully, asked specific questions, wrote down the data, and then left for a few minutes. When he returned, he had a printed file and a more serious expression. This man has appeared in other records. Similar frauds. Change of identity. There are reports abroad too. Your case could help. Laura left in silence, with a new feeling she couldn't name. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't relief. It was a strange kind of justice, as if, finally, something was out of her control, but at the same time acting in her favor. As if, even though she couldn't change the past, she could at least prevent other people from falling into the same trap. That same week, Laura unexpectedly ran into Daniel at a bookstore during a launch of an author they both admired. He was alone, leafing through a copy, and she hesitated for a few seconds before approaching him. Her heart raced, but she went. When they met, they exchanged a light smile and, naturally, he invited her to sit with him. There was no longer any tension. They talked about books, about the social projects they had both embraced, about the city, and finally, she mentioned the envelope. She recounted the entire sequence, the photo, the name, the trip to the police, the discovery that the man was part of a network of emotional and financial scams. Daniel listened attentively, without showing any surprise. When she finished, he simply said, "I imagined it. Not because you deserved it, but because people like him always leave traces." Laura smiled, embarrassed, but grateful for that compassionate tone. "It's strange, for a long time, I thought you were the end of my story. Now I see that you were the part that taught me who I was. And who I can still be." Daniel was silent for a moment, deep in thought, and replied, "You taught me too. But we don't choose how we learn. Sometimes, pain teaches us more than love." It was one of those moments when there was no need to say anything else. They both knew there was no going back. Not because there was no affection, but because time had made them different people. What they had experienced together, good and bad, was now a matter of memories, not gifts. And there, in that bookstore, among shelves of memories that weren't theirs, they realized they were at peace with that. In the following days, Laura continued her work at the orphanage. The children began to show progress with art. One of them, Gabriel, a quiet and withdrawn 9-year-old boy, began to open up through his paintings. In one of his paintings, he drew a broken bridge that he himself rebuilt with pieces of colored paper. Laura, seeing that, felt a lump in her throat. It was as if that child, without knowing, had translated what she herself was experiencing internally. Rebuilding from what was broken. That gave her a strength she hadn't found in a long time. And with this strength, he decided something unexpected, to write his story. Not as a sensationalist exposé, but as a tale of vulnerability and learning. He began writing every night in old notebooks, and then transferred them to the computer. "I wanted other women, other men, anyone who had gotten lost in their own decisions, to know that there is a way out. That there is a fall, but also reinvention." One Sunday afternoon, while walking through a craft fair, Laura was approached by a young journalist who remembered her participation in an exhibition months ago. The woman praised the paintings, said she was putting together a project of interviews with local artists who had overcome traumatic experiences, and asked if Laura would agree to participate. There was hesitation. There was still a fear of exposing herself. But after a pause, she said yes. The interview was recorded in a small, bright room. The questions were sensitive and respectful. At the end, the journalist asked, "If you could talk to yourself from a year ago, what would you say?" Laura thought for a long time and answered, "I would say that making mistakes does not define you, but running away from responsibility does. And that rebuilding is not about erasing, it is about embracing the pieces. All of them." A few days later, the video went viral on local networks. Comments poured in, messages of support, some criticism, but mainly identification. People wrote saying that they had also been deceived, betrayed, exposed, abandoned. There was a network of pain, yes, but also a silent current of empathy. Laura, for the first time in a long time, felt that her voice had weight, that her mistake was not the end but part of a larger narrative. And, even though this didn't erase the pain it caused, it gave meaning to what had been building since then. Daniel watched the video. He didn't comment, like, or send a message. But he watched it all the way through, in silence. When he finished, he just closed his laptop, took a deep breath, and went out onto the balcony. The woman who was now part of his life appeared with 2 cups of tea. They sat side by side, in silence. After a while, she asked if everything was okay. He said yes. He didn't tell her what he had seen, but he did say something she wasn't expecting: pain teaches us. But there are things we only understand when we see someone else heal. She didn't answer. She just held his hand. That night, Laura walked through the city streets with her shoulders less heavy. There were still difficult nights, there were still memories that burned, but now she walked with the certainty that she was not just the woman who betrayed, who was deceived, who lost everything. She was also the woman who did not run away from her own guilt, who got up from the ground with her own wounded knees, and who now touched lives with what she had learned. She knew she would never have Daniel back. But she also knew that maybe she didn't need to. The love she felt for him now was grateful, not possessive. And that, in itself, was already liberating. The following week, she received an email from the police officer she had spoken to. The man who had deceived her had been located abroad, extradited on another charge, and was now facing an international investigation. His testimony had been added to the case, and it would likely help to expand the case. Laura responded with just a "thank you." She didn't want revenge, just closure. She knew justice came in many forms, and some of them weren't loud. As he looked out the window that night, he saw his own reflection. She no longer saw herself as a victim or a villain. She was an ordinary woman, who made mistakes, yes, but who also had the courage to face them head-on. And, above all, that she had learned that loving someone requires presence, but loving yourself requires courage. And now, finally, she was ready for whatever was to come. Because it was whole. Even with scars. Even with memories. But whole. Time passed like a slow, steady tide, and with it, transformations settled in bodies and destinies that seemed to have nothing more to say. But time, that cruel and necessary master, does not only soothe wounds, it reveals what resisted and what collapsed once and for all. And it was precisely time that led to the outcome that no one had anticipated. Laura continued her life amidst the ink strokes, the stained papers and the difficult words that she still insisted on translating for herself. She became a silent reference within a small cultural circuit, not because of her technique, but because of the emotional strength that emanated from her works. Her paintings spoke of loss, new beginnings, and pain with a rare honesty. She was sought out by journalists, by broken people, by curious people in search of catharsis. Everyone saw in her someone who had survived what seemed unforgivable. But what few people knew was that, deep down, there were still nights when she woke up scared, with his name between her teeth, as if her subconscious was still trying to beg for a chance that would never come back. During a lecture on overcoming difficulties through art, Laura met an unexpected figure. The wife of one of the partners of the man who had deceived her, a woman with a hard look, impeccable posture and a countenance that hid as much as it revealed. After the lecture, she approached her. She said that she had watched the interview Laura had given months ago and that, since then, she had been carrying something that she could no longer keep quiet. In a simple envelope, she placed in Laura's hands a copy of a transfer made between international accounts, dated months before the fraud was committed. The amount was high. But the most surprising thing was the name involved as co-author of one of the transactions, a well-known female name, which Laura would never have expected to find there. The name of the woman who was now walking beside Daniel. The discovery was like a cold blade against the back of her neck. Laura left the event without answering, driving aimlessly, trying to organize her thoughts. It didn't make sense. She didn't want anything more from Daniel, she didn't hold out any hope, but knowing that this woman could have some involvement, even if indirect, in the scheme that destroyed her, was like a blow to something she already thought was buried. Her mind went back to the details, how they met so quickly, how Daniel seemed so certain that the other man was a fraud from the beginning, how he knew exactly the right moment to walk away. For the first time, Laura allowed herself to consider that maybe it wasn't just her who acted in a calculated way. What if it hadn't all been so accidental after all? What if there were pieces on the board that she never had access to? Laura kept the envelope, didn't look for Daniel, didn't confront anyone. But from that day on, the world he had been rebuilding with so much effort began to gain new cracks. What was firm became unstable, not because of the past, but because of the weight of the questions that were born there, raw, without answers. Still, she didn't back down. He continued to paint, he continued to teach. But now, with a new layer of silence in his eyes. A silence that said, maybe no one here was innocent. Daniel, in turn, began to notice distances in his new relationship. The woman who had helped him find himself again began to show signs of tension. Small slips, sudden absences, cold justifications. Nothing too obvious, but Daniel had learned to read between the lines. One night, when he arrived home early from work, he found the door ajar. He entered slowly and heard muffled voices coming from the bedroom. It wasn't a case of romantic infidelity, not this time. It was a tense, professional call. And in the middle of the captured sentences, he heard mentions of the name of the man who had destroyed Laura's life. His blood ran cold. He waited for her to hang up. When he confronted her, she denied it, then prevaricated, then burst into tears. The truth was painful. She had, in fact, been involved with that man. Not for romance, but for shady business deals, for promises of investments. Daniel was, for her, a convenient bridge. Nothing started with love. Everything started with strategy. Later, perhaps, she even fell in love. But the beginning was so contaminated by interests that there was no way to distinguish the real from the manipulated. The disappointment was deep, but not brutal. Daniel was no longer the same man who had been destroyed by Laura. It was different now. More skeptical, quieter, but also stronger. He separated from his new partner coldly. There were no scandals, no arguments. Just silence and a definitive exit. He sold everything, apartment, shares, furniture. He left town weeks later without a trace. They say he went south, opened a small inn in a seaside village, where he spent his days looking after books and cultivating hydrangeas. Don't talk about the past anymore. Does not serve journalists. Does not respond to messages. But it keeps, in a simple frame, a photograph that no one understands why it is there. It is a canvas painted by Laura, with gray and yellow tones, and a bridge rebuilt in the middle of an abyss. Laura learned of his departure through third parties. She felt the impact like someone who sees a candle suddenly go out. She didn't cry. She didn't search. She simply went up to the attic and painted a new canvas, an empty boat in the middle of a dark lake, with a single point of light reflected in the water. She sold this work in a private exhibition, without signing it. When the buyer asked to know who had done it, she simply replied, "A woman who learned that some stories can only end in silence." The man who deceived her was sentenced to more than 10 years in prison. But no one knows for sure whether all the accounts were traced, whether all the money was recovered. Some say that he left part of the amount with accomplices, that some powerful names still protect him. But for Laura, that justice no longer mattered. Because the greatest punishment was not prison. It was knowing that he didn't just break accounts, he broke hearts, homes, trust. And that, not even a cell can fix. In the end, each character found their own outcome. Not the one they wanted, but the one they built. Laura learned to live with her scars, Daniel found peace away from the noise, and the truth, that silent entity, came to light in a raw, unvarnished way. The story did not end with reconciliation, nor with revenge. It ended with transformation. Because not all pain generates anger. Some simply molds. Now, tell me, what did you think of this story? Would you have acted like Daniel? Would you have forgiven Laura? Or do you believe that betrayal is irreversible? Comment below with your opinion, we really want to know how this story affected you. And of course, if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell so you don't miss any new stories. Here, you will always find real, intense and remarkable narratives. And never forget, this channel does not support, under any circumstances, any form of betrayal. Here, truth, loyalty and consequence are always courageously exposed. Until the next story.